Welcome back to the School of Muscle podcast. Today, Drake joins me, and this is a fun podcast for me because Drake and I actually went to the University of Northern Iowa together and got our kind of masters together. And now Drake has moved on to do much smarter things than myself and is actually going on to get his PhD. And that's kind of what we're going to dive in today, is kind of some of his work regarding his PhD and how that potentially relates to this podcast, growing muscle, improving your physique and stuff like that. So with that, Drake, I think a good kind of place to start here is maybe just kind of giving a little bit of background on yourself, and then also we can kind of get into what you're doing for your PhD.
Yeah, absolutely. So like Ryan said, this will be fun because it's just two buddies catching up from back at UNI. But background for me, so I got my start in the broad field of what would be considered sports science back at Northern Iowa, working under a kind of a co-mentor for both of us, Dr. Jacob Reed, doing a lot of subjective athlete monitoring stuff. So tracking how athletes feel subjectively when it comes to fatigue and recovery throughout their competitive season. And I did some work with the volleyball gals and the softball team there at UNI. So that got my start. Recreationally, I got into powerlifting in college and stuff like that. So that segued into a lot of opportunities for me later on. So after my master's, I took a gap year. So just to back up a little bit, master's was in exercise science, took a gap year, and then I decided I wanted to kind of finish the job with grad school, take it all the way, and get a PhD. So I got the opportunity to work in the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Laboratory at the University of Kansas. Dr. Andy Fry, who is a pretty heavy hitter in the field of sport endocrinology and so forth, offered me a position as a research assistant and a teaching assistant in the lab, and started the PhD 2 years now, so going into the first semester of year 3. So we do a ton of stuff there, as we'll kind of get into on the pod, but fully pursuing the research life right now.
Awesome. And real quick, maybe what made you decide to go kind of the PhD route? Like when I finished my master's, dude, I was totally ready to be done with things. So
I was pretty fried too. I took a gap year. Did some work with the good boys, Josh Pelland and Zach Robinson of Data Driven Strength, and got started with them a little bit, and started to get a sort of a side income as a coach and so forth during that gap year. So that was a welcome break. But yeah, I was definitely in the same boat as you, Ryan, where post-masters, I was like, you write that thesis, you defend, and you're like, all right, I could use a little time off. So I took that, but I applaud the folks that just run it straight through from undergrad to PhD, start to finish. What made me decide to go back, honestly, I felt, or I still feel, that the PhD is going to offer so many opportunities afterwards. In some ways, it pigeonholes you into like a very niche specialty, but our lab is kind of positioned where we have a really cool opportunity, such that because we work in this applied sports science space, that if we want to go into academia afterwards and be a professor, we can. But if we want to go into industry and work with collegiate or pro teams, potentially that opportunity is also there, and be a formal sports scientist. So again, kind of have two pathways that I can pursue, and I feel like all the folks that, all my colleagues in the lab, we all have very unique opportunities to take advantage of. So that opportunity specifically at this institution within our lab was kind of the main draw. Obviously, I wanted to get the PhD. You got to be motivated going in because it's going to be a long haul for sure. But yeah, just opening doors in the applied space was really what drew me back.
And is it a 3-year program? So is this your last year, or do you have more after that?
Yeah, so traditionally it's 4. Most of us will get done in 3.5. Fingers crossed, right? It just depends on the dissertation and how that flows. Some programs in other fields are a little longer, and somewhere around 5. But yeah, we're lucky enough to be in that 3.5 to 4 year territory. So definitely still a commitment, but a little faster than some PhDs that I've talked to.
Definitely a commitment, especially after 5 years or whatever it is after.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, I always joke. I'm like, am I in 20th grade right now? I don't know, man.
For sure. Cool. Well, kind of with that kind of leads us into what you're kind of doing for your dissertation. And, prior to kind of recording this, you kind of mentioned that it's related to blood flow restrictions. So maybe just kind of give us a rundown on what you're kind of doing for your dissertation.
Yeah, for sure. So just give a little bit of an overview in terms of what the PhD trajectory looks like. First couple of years, especially year one, you're kind of usually tasked or get involved with a variety of different projects that can span a very broad range. So my first publication was on like a portable isometric testing rig, which will be out here soon, probably in a month or so. But that's not related to BFR, right? So like you get involved in a variety of different things. You get on a couple projects or so forth, and you kind of see what your interest really is sometimes. Some folks come in out the gate, they're like, this is what I'm doing. I'm going to run with it the full 4 years, which is fantastic. But you kind of get your toes wet a little bit the first couple of years. So this topic of blood flow restricted training, for any of the listeners that may not know what BFR is, in essence, all this training modality is you're taking something similar to a blood pressure cuff. It's a little larger in size and so forth. And you're trapping the venous blood within the exercising muscle such that the venous blood cannot escape. However, the arterial blood going into the muscle can still enter. So it's not a tourniquet. It could be used in such a way if the pressures were high enough, but you're just trapping the venous blood in the working musculature. So this training modality, in essence, limits the muscle's performance, right? Because this venous blood, you get pooling of the blood, you'll get the entrapment of a variety of different like metabolic byproducts and so forth. So you can't really do the same repetitions at a fixed load with BFR that you could if you went to failure without that occlusion, okay? This training modality is very common in rehab settings, like return to play after an injury. It limits the loads that an athlete can be exposed to. However, the muscular growth experienced when you train with this occlusion seems to be just as good as traditional resistance training, so like heavy load stuff. And we theorize in our lab, and part of my PhD is that maybe this would have a sort of additive effect on the training of well-trained folks. So folks like myself, Ryan, a lot of the clients we work with, etc. It's like once you're pretty far along in your training career, it might take a little bit more to move the needle if you're checking all the boxes outside of training, etc. So we think BFR could provide a unique enough stimulus such that it could be supplemental to your muscle growth pursuits, potentially even your muscle strength pursuits. So that's kind of the very general question that we're trying to dive into. One very small, unique part of that question, which is, does BFR have an additive effect for the training of well-developed athletes, well-developed physique competitors, etc.?
And what are maybe some like mechanisms of action for why it might be this independent contributor? Or maybe that's something you guys are still kind of exploring, but one thing you mentioned there was that it might just be more of a novel stimulus that more advanced trainees haven't really experienced. So that in of itself could be like a good independent contributor, but are there other kind of mechanisms specific to BFR that might make it a independent kind of additive contributor to hypertrophy compared to just doing like your basic traditional hypertrophy training?
Yeah. So if anyone listening remembers, that classic study from back in 2010, I think it was a review paper by Schoenfeld where he proposed the two mechanisms of growth, right? You got the mechanical stimulus and the metabolic, right? We know the mechanical stimulus, so muscle tension, that's going to be the primary driver by and large, and it has a lot of signaling pathways related to that tension. But the metabolic side it's kind of it's not a gray area, but there's a lot of different theories in that field, right? Like lactate's been thrown around as maybe being anabolic by some folks, et cetera, and like a variety of different things. With BFR specifically, so there's, again, a variety of different theories. No one really knows specifically why it leads to almost equivalent growth compared to normal training. But like you said, Ryan, I think some of those theories hit on the novelty of BFR. So one thing is, you get that blood pooling. Is it sort of bathing the muscle in these metabolic byproducts and that leads to signaling? We're not really sure. The area we're really trying to dive down deep into is related to acute hormonal responses, specifically this branch of hormones called the catecholamines. So adrenaline, noradrenaline, dopamine is a catecholamine. We're not really concerned with that, mostly adrenaline. So when your adrenaline gets cranked up, It interacts with some receptors on skeletal muscle tissue called beta-2 adrenergic receptors. Once those change shape after they've been bound to adrenaline, it'll lead to some downstream signaling cascades in skeletal muscle that there's a variety of different things that adrenaline does. It leads to the bioavailability of carbohydrate or glucose within the muscle, etc. But it's also related to some acute increases in muscle protein synthesis and some other transcription-related factors that could aid growth. And that's a lot of the stuff that Dr. Andy Fry, my supervisor, did back under Dr. Kramer during his PhD, was look at adrenaline and this skeletal muscle response. So we think if anyone listening, they're like, okay, BFR, adrenaline, I get it. I've done it before. It's very uncomfortable. I could see how adrenaline's cranked up. That's kind of what we're leaning into as one possible theory here, is that in well-trained guys, if they train with this occlusion, they take it relatively close to failure, which is, already brutal in itself without occlusion, but now you add occlusion. What is that adrenaline response? And does that adrenaline response lead to a greater magnitude of this acute skeletal muscle signaling in well-trained guys? So that's the avenue we're going down now. We're working on part one of just quantifying that acute adrenaline response with some salivary proxies, and then we'll get into potentially blood work and some muscle stuff later.
Very interesting. I think a lot of people, when they think about muscle growth, they think about like just muscle protein synthesis, and they don't really think about all these other kind of pathways of growth, to where different hormone signaling and like you have mTOR and other upregulations of different things that can lead to a more just overall anabolic response. So I think that is super interesting, and I think that definitely something that a lot of my audience will be wanting to kind of stay up to date with. And is there kind of any insights that you can share with us so far regarding your dissertation in this, or any kind of interesting findings that you've had so far? Like, oh, I didn't kind of know that about BFR before kind of diving into this.
Yeah, for sure. So we're doing, again, like phase one of potentially a 2-part dissertation series here right now. About halfway through data collection with our initial just like explanatory or descriptive study, where we're trying to quantify that acute sympathetic nervous system response, so that fight or flight response in well-trained men in response to BFR. And so far, so a quick overview of the project thus far, we're having well-trained guys come into the lab. They have 4 visits. Visit 1 is just like baseline, back squat 1RM, leg extension 1RM, body comp, etc., just descriptive of the population. And then we're estimating the pressure it would take to fully occlude their legs, so stop, let go, full tourniquet mode with that blood flow, etc. We're estimating that with limb circumference and also their systolic blood pressure, which is like a pretty decent proxy for how much pressure it would take to fully go, no arterial inflow at all. And then after that, we're coming and exposing them to 3 different conditions, one of which is just passive BFR, which is what I'm calling it. Just you're going to sit there at the pressure you're going to train at for 10 minutes in the seated leg extension machine, no exercise, and we're just going to quantify throughout that 10-minute bout and up to 15 minutes post what that stress response is. So we'll take blood pressure measures, get some salivary measures for cortisol and an enzyme that's related to adrenaline called alpha amylase. We'll get blood lactate throughout, all of those things. And we're having them come in for the second experimental visit and do the same BFR pressure, so the same occlusion pressure, but take that seated leg extension machine at 30% of their 1RM for 4 sets to true muscle failure, so momentary muscle failure, not volitional, with 1 minute of rest in between. We're going to quantify the same measures, so salivary cortisol, alpha amylase, blood pressure, every set, and so forth, and see how that changes when we add the exercise stressor. And then the final visit is you'll come in, whatever reps you do to failure, no occlusion, you'll hit the same reps, free flow, so no occlusion again, and we'll just quantify the same thing. So we're trying to see what is the additive effect on that acute fight or flight response when training with BFR. And so far, I mean, surprise, surprise, when you train with occlusion, it is more stressful. Again, preliminarily, we're about halfway through, but it does lead to potentially a heightened sympathetic response. So if that holds true, after we finish the remainder of data collection, then that could open the door to actually looking at some muscle signaling pathways.
Gotcha. So the preliminary, at least, it seems like kind of what you would expect. training with BFR results in that greater sympathetic response, which might kind of bathe yourself in these kind of stress response hormones a bit more, which might lead to an upregulation of these different hypertrophy pathways and different things like that, which might be at least one of the mechanisms of action for why BFR could be this independent contributor to muscle growth.
Yeah, 100%. Great summary. And I will also say for anyone listening, it's, we're looking at one growth pathway, but in reality, you got probably dozens, no joke, all working in synchrony with one another after an acute bout of exercise. So even if we find some glimmer of hope that one pathway might be more prominent than the others, it's like everything's working in tandem with one another. Human physiology is messy, baby. So it's like, it's hard to pin down, whether I can hang my hat on this or not. I don't know. Is this going to explain everything? Probably not. But that's the blessing and the curse of mechanistic data, is like, you hit one pathway, you might get some inkling of hope there that it could be responsible for that growth to some degree, but you'll never know for sure, right?
Yep, absolutely. And then, ideally after, say this goes well and the mechanistic data suggests that, hey, this could be an independent contributor, then maybe at that point it comes to doing maybe some more applied studies to where you look at outcome results of training with BFR compared to a control and seeing if, okay, this mechanistic data kind of pans out, but does it actually pan out with outcome data in like more of an applied setting?
Yeah. And for all of us, right, working in the applied space, the outcome data is that's really what we care about, right? Did you get larger, vastus lateralis cross-sectional area? Did you get stronger and so forth? But, outcome data has its limitations as well, right? Like, are you controlling for their nutrition throughout that training intervention and their sleep, etc.? Like it also gets noisy. So pros and cons to both routes in the research space for sure.
Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of sets up what you're doing currently with blood flow restriction training and what you guys are aiming to find. And I'll definitely have to get you back on once that's pubbed and we'll dive into that a bit more. But maybe like as it stands regarding blood flow restriction training with like your applied experience as well as the research that you've done on it, where would you kind of maybe recommend experimenting or trying out blood flow restriction training, especially for someone looking to kind of maximize their physique, muscle growth, and different things like that? As personally speaking, I've never tried it, and that's mostly because of for one, it sucks. I've heard from everybody that it sucks. I could definitely tell.
You'd love it.
I don't think I would, man.
No, dude. The first time you'd be like, that was wild.
I got to do it again.
Wild. You might not do it again, but yeah.
All right. Well, it's probably only a matter of time before I do have to give it a try. But there are like practical limitations of it to where for one, it kind of sucks. And then for two, you like might have to bring a blood pressure cuff or something to kind of occlude your blood. So that's kind of like a barrier to where, the average person go to the gym, they're not going to want to be the guy like, occluding their leg as they're going to do leg extensions. So like for who would you maybe recommend this to, or maybe what are some potential good use cases of blood flow restriction training, assuming that it can be potentially a good avenue of hypertrophy and could potentially be similar to just more traditional hypertrophy training?
Yeah, absolutely. Love this question because it's like, when the rubber hits the road, what do we do with it, right? So I'll focus on the application to like a healthy, well-resistant trained population instead of the rehab space. Obviously after say like an athlete tears their ACL, BFR has a ton of utility because they can't lift very heavy, and BFR limits what they can do from a loading standpoint. But in the healthy population, so my current theory is that if you're relatively novice or just haven't trained a lot already and you're starting to get into the weight room and so forth, I don't think like you really need to do BFR whatsoever. You're going to make such robust, growth gains and strength gains in the first few years that you don't really need to dabble in that at all, probably, right? But say you got the flip side of that coin, someone that's been training for, say 10 plus years, very advanced, right? Does BFR have any utility there? And I think that's where our theory right now is that it might. And I think in the practical application of it, I always recommend that people throw it in sort of a supplementary fashion. So after your leg day or whenever you're hitting quads, hamstrings, whatever, maybe at the end of that session, you're going to do 3 or 4 sets of BFR on the seated leg extension or leg curl, and take every set, relatively close to failure or whatever your rep scheme is, and sort of finish the session with that. Okay. So you're not going to do like BFR squats, BFR RDLs and like everything. Like the utility of it in my mind is it's always supplemental to all the other tried and true stuff that you're already going to be doing. So that's how I would recommend applying it. I also think theoretically, the concept of like muscle resensitization to stimuli could be something that BFR really gets at, where if you do a lot of high rep stuff and you periodize it such that you get into some heavier loads, for bodybuilder, let's say, they're tapping into like 6 to 8 rep range, which is their heavy work maybe, right? Does BFR immediately after that, your next block, that might be like work capacity focus, where you're doing sets 12 to 20 plus maybe. I think BFR could really hammer home that resensitization stimulus in the realm of like those metabolic factors and so forth. That's very theoretical. I don't necessarily have data to support that BFR leads to this heightened like stimulus after some relatively low non-specific like training like that. But I think that could be one way to plug it in. So like periodize it, probably don't use it all the time, maybe throw it in for a block here and there when you really want to hammer home that muscle pump sensation when you haven't been getting a whole lot of that, and throw it in at the end of your session, on some movements that make sense. So single joint stuff, leg extensions, leg curls, bicep curls, tricep pushdowns, stuff like that. But outside of that, do not just train with occlusion the whole time on everything, right?
And to me, it sounds pretty similar to how I would program other intensity techniques like drop sets or like same muscle group supersets and stuff like that. Like I'm personally not going to program that for every single exercise, especially like, doing drop sets on like barbell back squats. I don't know. That just seems pretty wild, but on certain isolation lifts and stuff like that, just kind of sprinkling it in throughout your program over the course of a macro cycle, I think it can make a lot of sense. And for BFR specifically, I do think it really has the benefit of being a novel stimulus for most people. As I would say, if you're really in the weeds of fitness and bodybuilding and stuff like that, you've probably heard of blood flow restriction training, but I think even if you've heard of it, a lot of people haven't really kind of given it a go. So I think it does have that novel stimulus component, and it could be a really good way, like you mentioned, to work around injury. And if, even if someone, I've had several clients to where their knees are bothering them and they really can't load like a back squat or something like that, and they're just doing tons and tons of leg extensions or something like that because they're working around that injury. Well, rather than just doing, 10 straight sets of leg extensions, maybe we work in some blood flow restriction training for the sake of variety or something like that.
Yeah, no, yeah, 100%. It's very much like it's an intensification technique in a way for sure, but I think it's uniquely different than something like a drop set or even like myo reps, which some people may be familiar with and so forth, in the sense that like you are altering the acute physiology within that working muscle to a greater degree than those other modalities, I would argue, right? Because you are like physically occluding that venous blood from escaping. Like most of it's not leaving, so you're getting that swelling response and so forth, which could lead to some unique like maybe muscle damage responses, etc. Which not that damage equates to growth, but there's a unique response there that you might not necessarily get if you just did a drop set. So it's very advanced. Again, that's my current frame of thinking. If you've been in the game a while and you got a lagging body part and you want to give it a go, I think it makes sense. If you're new to training and you're just your nutrition, sleep, etc. isn't really dialed in that much, and you're like, hey, but I train hard and this sounds awesome. Like, you give it a go maybe and just see what you think, but it's probably not going to be the secret sauce, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe just for a final point here, just like practically speaking, if someone wanted to implement blood flow restriction training, is there like any recommendations that you can give when it even comes to like the type of blood restriction kind of cuff or whatever they use for that? And then also like how hard to restrict it or other kind of just practical implications. Like if someone's like, hey, I want to try this out on my leg extensions, how do they even kind of like get started with that?
Yeah, so just like a lot of like different training gear, like BFR, the cuffs themselves are, there's a variety of different price ranges for stuff that you could use. On the high end, like clinical grade stuff, there's some super expensive, like very precise, like tourniquet style systems out there. On the low end, honestly, like some of the original research on it is just using like knee wraps or some other elastic wrap to occlude the limbs. And there's some decent guidelines for how to determine the occlusion or the tightness of those wraps. I can't think of the paper off the top of my head, but maybe Ryan, if you have show notes, etc., I could send it to you and you could drop it down there. There's a good paper where they'll use an elastic wrap, and depending upon the circumference of your thigh, so first you'll take the wrap, let me back up. You'll take the wrap, you'll measure out the distance that is equivalent to the circumference of your thigh. Say you're doing leg extensions, right? You'll measure that out. And then once you put it on, that mark that you made on that elastic wrap will fit real nicely end to end, because you know it's, say, 60 centimeters in length, which is the same circumference of your thigh muscles. So you'll put that on, and then the tightness that you'll use is you'll pull it to either, a third of that distance, a half of that distance, a quarter, etc. And there's some decent, again, there's a really decent practical article on that in detail, which could be useful. Personally, when I train, I use that sort of style whenever I use BFR or that pressure gauge, because, an elastic wrap on Amazon, you can buy like a BFR elastic wrap for like $10-15 or something like that, right? So I'll send that to Ryan, and anyone interested, check out the show notes for that article. In the mid-range though, if you're financially good or stable enough, so forth, to afford them, there are some decent like mid-price range, like $300 to $500 cuff systems that you could use for a really long time that automatically calculate the pressure at which it would go full tourniquet style system, and then you can prescribe a percentage of that, say like 80% of whatever pressure is needed to stop the arterial inflow to the muscle. So again, in that middle ballpark, if you were really, really juiced up about BFR, I would recommend people go towards that mid-range if you really wanted to use it long term. But people can get a pretty decent occlusion stimulus with just those more practical, like elastic band style setups there, with just, again, kind of back the napkin. What is your limb circumference? I'm going to go with a third of that, and that's going to be pretty close to the tightness I need.
This might be a double question, but do you effectively just tighten it before your set, and then once you finish your set, you just loosen it again?
No, for sure. So there's different ways to implement it. One way that I use pretty much all the time is just continuous. So if you're doing 4 sets of leg extensions, as long as it doesn't take you more than like 10-12 minutes tops to do all 4 sets, then you'll just occlude. So you'll tighten it at the start, knock out your first set, and while you're sitting there, you'll rest a minute or two, preferably just a minute, and then you'll knock out set 2, 3, and 4 with the occlusion on the whole time. So you'll stay occluded during your rest periods. I think that's, to some degree, maybe an important factor. There is some research comparing that to other styles, such as intermittent BFR, where you'll occlude for the exercise duration, and then you'll remove the occlusion while you recover, and then you'll occlude again during exercise. But I think that continuous occlusion could be unique in that it limits your muscle's ability to recover during that 1 minute of rest, and it keeps that occlusion trapped for the duration of those 4 sets, say, again, on the upper end, 10, maybe 12 minutes if it takes you that long. So I personally use continuous, but you can kind of do whatever. If you want to drop that occlusion during the rest period because you're like, my legs are, I feel that occlusion stimulus, they're kind of numb, I feel that pressure, then you can drop it too. There's research to support both modalities right now.
Perfect. Well, I think that's a good overview on your guys' dissertation, what you're doing for BFR, and some practical recommendations there. So with that, Drake, I think we're coming up on time here. I'm definitely going to have you on again for sure. But in the meantime, where can people kind of find you online to kind of stay up to date with what you're doing, or any kind of content that you're producing or anything like that?
Yeah, for sure. So I got out of the content game a while back, so I haven't updated anything on Instagram for a minute, but I do coach and do a variety of other things for data-driven strength. So DDS, for anyone that is familiar. So we do a variety of things there. Again, one-on-one coaching. Josh and Zach and Jake Remmer kind of lead the charge in the content game, but we have a lot of cool things there. Other than that, if you want to kind of get some insight, or if you're interested in research whatsoever, and you want to learn more about what the heck does a sports science lab even do, right? What research do they put out? On Instagram, you can track down the Jayhawk Athletic Performance Lab and get some insight into some of the articles we put out, some of the activities we do, and so forth, just to get some, again, kind of a little teaser on what activities we're involved in, and can give you some insight into what a PhD in that applied space might kind of look like.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on today, Drake. I really appreciate it.
No, for sure. Good to catch up, Ryan.
Awesome, man. With that, thank you everyone for tuning into this. As always, if you're interested in one-on-one coaching with me, you can contact me directly, Ryan@revivestronger.com. And with that, I will see you in that next one.